The observation deck of the Kralix slave ship hummed with cruel laughter. Zira pressed herself against the cold metal wall, her small frame trembling as 3 guards circled her like predators toying with wounded prey. Her violet skin bore fresh bruises and her large dark eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ship's engines. "Please don't hurt me again." The largest guard, a hulking Kralix named Vorth, threw his head back and roared with amusement. His companions joined in, their laughter echoing through the cramped space where a dozen other captured beings huddled in silence, too frightened to intervene. "Did you hear that?" Vorth sneered, his scaled face twisting into a grotesque smile. "The little Lyrian thinks begging will save her." He raised his shock prod, the tip crackling with blue energy that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Zira had been free once. She remembered the meadows of her homeworld, the way the twin suns painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. She remembered her family's laughter, so different from the mockery that surrounded her now. That was before the Kralix came, before they burned her village and took everyone young enough to sell. The shock prod descended, and Zira cried out as pain lanced through her body. She collapsed to the floor, her muscles spasming uncontrollably. The guards laughed harder. "The auction is in 2 cycles," one of the other guards said, kicking her side casually. "Try not to damage her too badly. Lyrians fetch good prices when they're intact." "There's plenty left to break that won't show," Vorth replied, reaching down to grab her arm. Across the galaxy, in a system the Kralix had barely heard of, something stirred. The Terran Federation had been monitoring the slave routes for months, ever since they discovered the extent of the Kralix trafficking network. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers, oddities with their strange emotional attachments and their ridiculous codes of honor. The Kralix had dismissed them entirely. Humans were weak, they said, soft. Their military was small, their ships unremarkable. They talked endlessly about rights and dignity and justice, concepts that meant nothing in a galaxy where strength determined survival. On the bridge of the stealth ship Shadow of Earth, Captain Maria Chen studied the holographic display before her. The Kralix slave vessel had been tagged 3 days ago by a surveillance drone. It was heading toward the Corvin auction houses carrying an estimated 40 captives from 6 different species. "Weapon status?" she asked quietly. "Armed and ready, Captain," her tactical officer replied. "Though I should note we're violating about 17 different treaties by being in Kralix space." "Noted and logged," Maria said, her expression hardening. "Communications, do we have the translation algorithms ready?" "Yes, ma'am. We can broadcast in all major languages once we're in range." Maria nodded slowly. She'd read the reports about the Kralix operation. She'd seen the images of broken beings sold like livestock, of families torn apart, of children who'd never see their homes again. The Galactic Council did nothing because the Kralix were powerful and well-connected. They paid their dues, followed most of the major laws, and kept their darker business just subtle enough that the Council could pretend ignorance. But humanity hadn't survived multiple world wars, a nuclear age, and the colonization of a hostile solar system by learning to look away from injustice. "All hands to combat stations," Maria ordered, "and somebody wake up our diplomatic team. They're going to need to earn their pay today." The Shadow of Earth wasn't a warship in the traditional sense. It was designed for rescue operations, for extracting human colonists from disaster zones and hostile territories. But it carried enough firepower to make most pirates think twice, and its crew had trained for situations exactly like this. As the ship accelerated toward the Kralix vessel, Maria allowed herself a grim smile. The Kralix were about to learn an important lesson about humanity, one that would echo across the galaxy in the years to come. Some lines should never be crossed. Back on the slave ship, Zira lay on the cold floor, every breath sending waves of agony through her battered body. The guards had finally tired of their sport and returned to their posts, leaving her alone with her pain and her memories. She thought of her younger brother, who'd been taken to a different ship. She thought of her mother's final scream as the Kralix had dragged them apart. She thought of all the promises she'd made to herself about staying strong, about surviving long enough to find a way home. Those promises felt hollow now. "It's going to be okay," a small voice whispered from the shadows. Zira turned her head slightly to see a young Valorian child, no more than 6 cycles old, peering at her through the bars of the holding pen. My mother says the gods protect the innocent. Zira wanted to tell the child the truth, that there were no gods coming to save them, that innocence meant nothing to creatures like the Kralix. But she couldn't bring herself to crush that fragile hope. Maybe, she whispered back, her voice hoarse. The Valorian child smiled, a heartbreaking expression of trust and faith that Zira knew would be beaten out of him soon enough. That was how the Kralix operated. They broke you slowly, methodically, until you forgot you'd ever been anything other than property. The ship's alarms suddenly blared to life, red lights flashing throughout the cargo hold. The guards rushed to their stations, shouting in confusion. Zira heard Vorth's voice over the intercom, anger replacing his usual cruel amusement. Unknown vessel approaching at combat speed. All security to defensive positions. Through the small viewport in the hold, Zira could see nothing but the darkness of space and the distant stars that had witnessed so much suffering without intervention. She closed her eyes, expecting another horror to add to her collection. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. She had no way of knowing that the ship approaching carried members of a species that had written declarations of human rights, that had fought wars against tyranny, that had looked at the darkness of the universe and decided that some things were worth fighting for. The humans were coming, and they were very, very angry. The observation deck of the Kralix slave ship hummed with cruel laughter. Zira pressed herself against the cold metal wall, her small frame trembling as 3 guards circled her like predators toying with wounded prey. Her violet skin bore fresh bruises and her large dark eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ship's engines. "Please don't hurt me again." The largest guard, a hulking Kralix named Vorth, threw his head back and roared with amusement. His companions joined in, their laughter echoing through the cramped space where a dozen other captured beings huddled in silence, too frightened to intervene. "Did you hear that?" Vorth sneered, his scaled face twisting into a grotesque smile. "The little Lyrian thinks begging will save her." He raised his shock prod, the tip crackling with blue energy that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Zira had been free once. She remembered the meadows of her homeworld, the way the twin suns painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. She remembered her family's laughter, so different from the mockery that surrounded her now. That was before the Kralix came, before they burned her village and took everyone young enough to sell. The shock prod descended, and Zira cried out as pain lanced through her body. She collapsed to the floor, her muscles spasming uncontrollably. The guards laughed harder. "The auction is in 2 cycles," one of the other guards said, kicking her side casually. "Try not to damage her too badly. Lyrians fetch good prices when they're intact." "There's plenty left to break that won't show," Vorth replied, reaching down to grab her arm. Across the galaxy, in a system the Kralix had barely heard of, something stirred. The Terran Federation had been monitoring the slave routes for months, ever since they'd discovered the extent of the Kralix trafficking network. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 15 years ago, and they were still considered newcomers, oddities with their strange emotional attachments and their ridiculous codes of honor. The Kralix had dismissed them entirely. Humans were weak, they said, soft. Their military was small, their ships unremarkable. They talked endlessly about rights and dignity and justice, concepts that meant nothing in a galaxy where strength determined survival. On the bridge of the stealth ship Shadow of Earth, Captain Maria Chen studied the holographic display before her. The Kralix slave vessel had been tagged 3 days ago by a surveillance drone. It was heading toward the Corvin auction houses, carrying an estimated 40 captives from 6 different species. "Weapons status?" she asked quietly. "Armed and ready, Captain," her tactical officer replied. "Though I should note we're violating about 17 different treaties by being in Kralix space." "Noted and logged," Maria said, her expression hardening. "Communications, do we have the translation algorithms ready?" "Yes, ma'am. We can broadcast in all major languages once we're in range." Maria nodded slowly. She'd read the reports about the Kralix operation. She'd seen the images of broken beings sold like livestock, of families torn apart, of children who'd never see their homes again. The Galactic Council did nothing because the Kralix were powerful and well-connected. They paid their dues, followed most of the major laws, and kept their darker business just subtle enough that the Council could pretend ignorance. But humanity hadn't survived multiple world wars, a nuclear age, and the colonization of a hostile solar system by learning to look away from injustice. "All hands to combat stations," Maria ordered. "And somebody wake up our diplomatic team. They're going to need to earn their pay today." The Shadow of Earth wasn't a warship in the traditional sense. It was designed for rescue operations, for extracting human colonists from disaster zones and hostile territories. But it carried enough firepower to make most pirates think twice, and its crew had trained for situations exactly like this. As the ship accelerated toward the Kralix vessel, Maria allowed herself a grim smile. The Kralix were about to learn an important lesson about humanity, one that would echo across the galaxy in the years to come. Some lines should never be crossed. Back on the slave ship, Zira lay on the cold floor, every breath sending waves of agony through her battered body. The guards had finally tired of their sport and returned to their posts, leaving her alone with her pain and her memories. She thought of her younger brother, who'd been taken to a different ship. She thought of her mother's final scream as the Kralix had dragged them apart. She thought of all the promises she'd made to herself about staying strong, about surviving long enough to find a way home. Those promises felt hollow now. "It's going to be okay," a small voice whispered from the shadows. Zira turned her head slightly to see a young Valorian child, no more than 6 cycles old, peering at her through the bars of the holding pen. "My mother says the gods protect the innocent." Zira wanted to tell the child the truth, that there were no gods coming to save them, that innocence meant nothing to creatures like the Kralix. But she couldn't bring herself to crush that fragile hope. "Maybe," she whispered back, her voice hoarse. The Valorian child smiled, a heartbreaking expression of trust and faith that Zira knew would be beaten out of him soon enough. That was how the Kralix operated. They broke you slowly, methodically, until you forgot you'd ever been anything other than property. The ship's alarm suddenly blared to life, red lights flashing throughout the cargo hold. The guards rushed to their stations, shouting in confusion. Zira heard Vorth's voice over the intercom, anger replacing his usual cruel amusement. "Unknown vessel approaching at combat speed. All security to defensive positions." Through the small viewport in the hold, Zira could see nothing but the darkness of space and the distant stars that had witnessed so much suffering without intervention. She closed her eyes, expecting another horror to add to her collection. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change. She had no way of knowing that the ship approaching carried members of a species that had written declarations of human rights, that had fought wars against tyranny, that had looked at the darkness of the universe and decided that some things were worth fighting for. The humans were coming, and they were very, very angry. The Galactic Council chambers on Station Unity 7 had never seen such chaos. Representatives from 300 civilizations filled the amphitheater, their voices overlapping in a dozen languages as translation algorithms struggled to keep pace. At the center of the storm stood Ambassador James Howard, humanity's representative, his gray suit looking almost comically simple amid the elaborate robes and ceremonial armor of the other delegates. "Order," Council Speaker Velshara called, her forearms raised for silence. The insectoid matriarch's compound eyes gleamed with barely contained irritation. "The human delegation has been granted the floor. We will hear their explanation." James stood calmly, though inside his heart raced. What the Shadow of Earth had done 3 days ago had sent shockwaves through the entire galaxy. Now came the hard part, justifying it to beings who had tolerated slavery for millennia. "Thank you, Speaker," James began. "I'll be brief. 3 days ago, the Terran Federation intercepted a Kralix slave transport carrying 42 sapient beings. We disabled the vessel, freed the captives, and arrested the crew. All rescued individuals are receiving medical care and will be returned to their homeworlds." The Kralix ambassador, a massive creature named Gorvax, surged to his feet. "This is an act of war. Your species violated our sovereign space, attacked our vessel, and kidnapped Kralix citizens." "Those citizens," James replied evenly, "were slave traders operating in violation of the Galactic Charter's own prohibition on forced servitude. Article 7, Section 3 is a guideline, not a law," Gorvax roared. "It allows for traditional cultural practices including indentured servitude, penal labor, and resource acquisition from pre-spaceflight civilizations." James felt his jaw tighten. Resource acquisition. They'd reduced kidnapping and slavery to corporate terminology. Then perhaps it's time the council clarified that guideline into actual law. Laughter rippled through the chamber. The Valorian delegate, Ambassador Kress, spoke up, his melodious voice dripping with condescension. Young species, you have been part of this council for barely 15 of your years. You do not dictate policy. We're not asking permission, James said quietly. The laughter stopped. Silence fell across the chamber like a physical weight. Speaker Velshara leaned forward. Explain yourself, human. James pulled out a data pad, his hands steady despite the hundreds of alien eyes focused on him. In the past 72 hours, the Terran Federation has deployed 15 task forces across known slave routes. We have intercepted 9 more transport vessels, freed 217 captives, and destroyed 3 auction houses. We are uploading coordinates and evidence of 47 more slaving operations to the Council's database right now. Pandemonium erupted. Delegates shouted, translators overloaded, and several representatives activated their emergency communications to contact their homeworlds. Through it all, James stood motionless, letting the reality sink in. This is insanity, the Corvin representative hissed. You have no authority, no jurisdiction. Then give us authority, James shot back. Pass actual legislation with actual enforcement. Create a joint task force with real power to shut down these operations, or we'll keep doing it ourselves. You're threatening the council? Gorvax bellowed. No, James said softly. We're saving lives. If the council sees that as a threat, that tells me everything I need to know about the council's priorities. Halfway across the galaxy, Zira sat in the medical bay of the human station Armstrong 7, watching through the viewport as ships came and went. Her body was healing. The human doctors had erased most of the physical damage with technology that seemed like magic to her. But the scars inside went deeper than their machines could reach. How are you feeling today? Dr. Kim asked, entering with her ever-present smile. Zira had learned that humans smiled a lot, even when they were sad. Especially when they were sad, as if forcing happiness into existence through sheer will. Better, Zira replied honestly. The pain is less. Good. Sarah sat down beside her. I have news. We found your homeworld. Lyria is requesting your return. We can have you there in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. 14 days until she saw the twin sons again. Until she could search for what remained of her family. Zira should have felt joy. Instead, she felt empty. What about the others? She asked. The ones from the ship. The Valorian child, Krev? He's going home too. His mother survived. She's here on the station actually crying in the hallways because she can't believe she found him. Sarah's eyes grew distant. It doesn't always end that way. Some of the others, their homes were destroyed. Some don't want to go back to worlds that let them be taken. Where will they go? Sarah's smile turned genuine. Wherever they want. Earth has offered asylum to anyone who needs it. So have 24 other human colonies. Some of the rescued are already learning human languages, getting training for jobs. She paused. You could stay too if you wanted. No pressure. Just offering. Zira looked at the humans moving through the station, so purposeful, so certain. They were strange beings, these humans. They felt emotions so intensely it radiated from them like heat. They cried over strangers and raged at injustices that didn't affect them personally. Why do you care? Zira asked suddenly. We're not your people. Our suffering doesn't hurt you. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. You know what humans almost did to ourselves? We almost destroyed our own world. Wars. Weapons that could crack continents, poison that lasted centuries. We looked at our own reflection and saw monsters. She met Zira's eyes. So we decided to be better. When we found out we weren't alone in the universe, we hoped we'd find civilizations that had learned the same lessons. But you didn't. No, Sarah admitted. We found empires that enslaved entire species. Councils that looked away from atrocities, beings that treated morality like a suggestion. And we had to make a choice. Fit in with the galaxy as it is or try to change it. That's arrogant, Zira said, but there was no heat in it. Probably, Sarah agreed. But watching you suffer and doing nothing? That's not arrogance. That's cowardice. And humans have been called many things. But we refuse to be cowards. Back in the council chambers, the vote was approaching. Ambassador Howard had presented humanity's ultimatum clearly. Pass legislation making slavery a council-level crime with enforcement mechanisms, or humanity would continue unilateral action. You cannot force 300 civilizations to bend to your will, Ambassador Kress declared. We're not forcing anyone, James replied. We're just refusing to stand by.
Any civilization that wants to continue slavery is welcome to try.
But they'll have to go through us first. And if we sanction you, cut trade, restrict access to council space, James smiled thinly, then we lose access to some markets and some shortcuts. Meanwhile, people keep suffering. Is that really the calculation you want to make? Speaker Velshara called for order once more. A vote will be held at the next full council session in 30 days. Until then, the human actions remain, unsanctioned but not officially condemned. It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. As James left the chamber, several smaller species ambassadors approached him quietly. My world remembers when we were slaves, one whispered. 300 years ago. The council did nothing then either. Thank you, another murmured. My sister's children were taken last year. If your ships find them, James nodded to each of them. The real battle wasn't in the council. It was in every system where suffering had become so normalized that people forgot to be outraged by it. Humanity would remind them. The war room of the Kralix Imperial Command was a testament to military might. Holograms displayed fleet positions across 24 systems, each representing centuries of conquest and domination. High Commander Zarthok studied the latest reports, his massive claws tapping an irritated rhythm on the tactical table. 17 ships, he growled. In 1 month, these humans have cost us 17 ships and over 400 captured crew members. Defense Minister Kravek shifted nervously. Our intelligence underestimated them, Commander. Their stealth technology is decades ahead of projections. Their weapons are primitive but effective. And their tactics, what about their tactics? Zarthok demanded. They're not trying to win battles, sir. They're trying to save lives. They hit fast, disable rather than destroy. Grab prisoners and leave before reinforcements arrive. It's not warfare. It's rescue operations at military scale. Zarthok slammed his fist on the table. And the council does nothing? The council is divided. 40 species have now publicly supported the human proposal for anti-slavery legislation. Another 60 are maintaining neutrality. Many of our traditional allies are remaining silent, waiting to see which way the political winds blow. It was worse than Zarthok had thought. The humans weren't just attacking Kralix operations. They were attacking the entire political structure that had allowed slavery to flourish for millennia. And they were winning not through force but through shame. Show me the human military, he ordered. The hologram shifted, displaying data on the Terran Federation Navy. Zarthok studied the numbers with growing unease. On paper, humanity had fewer than 500 military vessels. Most were small frigates and destroyers. Nothing compared to the great dreadnoughts of the major empires. But those numbers didn't tell the real story. Human ships were fast, maneuverable, and operated by crews with a fanatical dedication to their mission. More importantly, humanity had something no other species possessed. A population that supported the war effort with near unanimity. Their casualty reports, Zarthok said. How many humans have died in these operations? Kravek hesitated. 43 confirmed killed in action. Another 100 wounded. And their response? More volunteers than their military can process. There are reports of human civilians forming private rescue organizations, buying ships with personal wealth, and joining the effort independently. Kravek pulled up social media data from Earth and its colonies. They call them freedom fleets. Their government is struggling to maintain operational control. Zarthok stared at the data in disbelief. Most civilizations grew weary of war when casualties mounted. Humans seemed to become more determined. Their media showed the faces of their dead not as deterrents but as martyrs. Their leaders gave speeches honoring sacrifice rather than questioning the mission. What kind of species willingly dies for aliens they've never met? He muttered. The dangerous kind, Kravek replied quietly. The hologram shifted again, showing a recorded message that had spread across the galactic network like wildfire. A young human soldier, wounded but alive, spoke directly to the camera from a hospital bed. My name is Corporal Ryan Mitchell. 3 days ago, our ship intercepted a slave transport. We saved 86 people. I took a plasma bolt to the chest doing it, and I'd do it again tomorrow. The soldier's eyes were fierce despite his injuries. To anyone out there still suffering, still captive, still afraid, we're coming. Humanity is coming, and we will not stop until every chain is broken and every slaver answers for their crimes. The message had been viewed billions of times across hundreds of worlds. It had inspired others. Valorian militia groups were now patrolling their own borders. The Lyrian government had formed its own anti-slavery task force. Even some council species were quietly beginning enforcement operations. We need to make an example, Zarthok decided. Prepare the Third Fleet. We find one of these human ships operating alone, and we destroy it. Completely let them see the cost of interfering. Sir, with respect that might escalate. It's already escalated. Zarthok roared. Every day we show weakness, more species join their cause. We crush the humans now, or we watch our entire economic system collapse. Meanwhile, on the human station Armstrong 7, Captain Chen received new orders from Terran Command. She read them twice, then looked at her assembled officers. We've been tasked with extracting prisoners from the Corvin auction world, she announced. It's not a ship this time. It's a planet. Her tactical officer whistled low. That's suicide, Captain. The Corvin system is heavily defended. We'd need to fight through orbital defenses, planetary shields, and ground forces. Which is why we're not going alone, Maria said, pulling up a star chart. Fleet Command is sending 3 more ships. We're also coordinating with the Lyrian Resistance and 2 Valorian cruisers. It'll be the largest joint operation since we started this campaign. Her crew exchanged glances. This was different from the quick raids they'd been running. This was a full military assault on a major slaving hub. The Corvin auction world processes 5,000 captives a month, Maria continued. Most are sold to buyers across the galaxy. Some are never seen again. Intelligence suggests there are currently 300 prisoners awaiting sale. She paused. We're going to get all of them out. And if the Kraliks respond with their fleet? Her XO asked. Maria's expression hardened. Then we show them what happens when you corner humans protecting innocence. We show them what real fury looks like. Back on Lyria, Zira had made her decision. She stood before a human recruiter, her violet skin still showing faint scars from her captivity. I want to join, she said firmly. The recruiter, a middle-aged woman named Captain Torres, studied her carefully. You understand what you're asking? You'd be going back out there facing the same people who hurt you. I understand, Zira replied, but I can't go home and pretend everything is normal. Not when others are still suffering what I suffered. You humans taught me something. What's that? That one person can make a difference. That standing up matters even when it's dangerous. Zira met Torres's eyes. You came for me when no one else would. Now I want to help you save others. Torres was quiet for a moment, then she smiled. We don't have military service requirements for non-citizens. But we could use translators, cultural advisors, trauma counselors, people who understand what the rescued have been through. I'll do whatever helps, Zira said. Then welcome to the team. Torres extended her hand, and Zira shook it, marveling at how such a simple gesture could mean so much. Across the galaxy, similar scenes played out. Species that had remained neutral were choosing sides. Some joined humanity's cause, inspired by their determination. Others, like the Kraliks, prepared for war, convinced that strength alone would preserve the old order. But what neither side fully understood yet was that humanity had changed the equation. They'd made slavery personal for billions of beings who'd never thought about it before. They'd put faces and names to suffering that had been statistics. And once you made people care, once you made them see the cost of their indifference, you couldn't make them unsee it. High Commander Zarthok would learn this lesson the hard way. His Third Fleet was already moving toward the Corvin system, preparing to crush the human operation there. He thought he was hunting humans. He didn't realize he was walking into a trap. The Corvin system hung in space like a jewel, its central planet a hub of commerce that had enriched countless merchants over the centuries. Among its many industries, none was more profitable than the auction houses. Here, beings from across the galaxy came to buy and sell everything from raw materials to sapient lives. Captain Maria Chen studied the tactical display aboard the Shadow of Earth, watching as her small fleet assembled at the rally point just outside sensor range. Besides her own ship, 3 other Terran vessels had arrived: the destroyer Righteous Fury, the assault carrier Liberation, and the medical ship Sanctuary. They were joined by 2 Valorian cruisers and a hodgepodge fleet of 12 smaller vessels crewed by Lyrian volunteers. It's not enough, her XO muttered, studying the intelligence on Corvin defenses. 20 orbital platforms, each carrying enough firepower to vaporize a small moon. Planetary shields that can withstand sustained bombardment. And now long-range sensors are picking up Kralik ships entering the system. How many? Maria asked calmly. 36 capital ships. It's their third fleet. They're not here by coincidence, Captain. They knew we were coming. Maria nodded slowly. She'd expected this. The Kralix had finally decided to make their stand, to show the galaxy what happened to species that challenged their authority. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange calm settling over her shoulders. Communications. Open a channel to all ships in our fleet. The channel activated, connecting her to captains from 3 different species, some military professionals, other civilians who'd bought ships with their savings and learned to fly them out of sheer determination. This is Captain Chen. By now you've all seen the Kralix fleet. They outgun us significantly. Command is offering any ship the option to withdraw without consequences. She paused. But if you stay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to save every single person on that planet, and we're going to make the Kralix regret ever thinking they could terrorize innocent beings without consequences. How? One of the Lyrian volunteers asked, his voice cracking slightly. We can't win a straight fight. Then we don't fight straight, Maria replied. The Kralix think they're hunting us. They think this is about military superiority, but they're wrong. This is about will. This is about who wants it more. And I guarantee you nobody in that Kralix fleet has the motivation we have. On the surface of Corvin Prime, Zira moved through the underground passages beneath the auction house complex. She wore a human stealth suit, its technology bending light around her, making her nearly invisible. Beside her, 3 human special forces operators moved with practiced efficiency. Target building is 200 meters ahead, Lieutenant Sarah Park whispered through the comm. Intel says approximately 50 prisoners in the holding pens. Zira had volunteered for the ground team, using her knowledge of slavery operations to help plan the rescue. The humans had hesitated initially but relented when she'd proven her determination, now creeping through the darkness toward the place where others suffered as she had. Zira felt something she hadn't experienced in months: purpose. They reached a ventilation shaft, and Park began cutting through the grating with a plasma torch. Above them, the auction continued. Zira could hear the auctioneer's voice echoing through the walls, describing merchandise with the same enthusiasm one might use for furniture. Lot 47. A young Valorian male, excellent physical condition, trained in basic labor tasks. Zira's hands clenched into fists. That could have been her up there, being sold like property while buyers examined her like livestock. You good? Park asked quietly, noticing her tension. I'm good, Zira replied. Let's move. In orbit, the Kralix Third Fleet approached with overwhelming confidence. High Commander Zarthok watched the human ships maintaining their position, clearly aware they were outmatched. Good. Let them feel fear. Let them understand the cost of defiance. All ships begin attack formation, he ordered. Target the human vessels first. I want wreckage, not prisoners. But as his fleet advanced, something unexpected happened. The orbital defense platforms around Corvin Prime suddenly went offline. Not damaged, just deactivated. What's happening? Zarthok demanded. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the Corvin planetary government. They're surrendering. What? The main view screen activated, showing a Corvin official looking nervous and defeated. High Commander, we cannot risk our planet becoming a battlefield. The humans have offered us terms. They promise no damage to our infrastructure if we cooperate with the prisoner extraction. You coward, Zarthok roared. The Kralix Empire will remember this betrayal. The Kralix Empire, the Corvin official replied with surprising steel, has cost us more in reputation damage over the past month than we've made from the slave trade in 5 years. The humans have won the propaganda war, Commander. Every species is watching this. If we fight, we become the villains they claim we are. The transmission cut off. Zarthok stared at the blank screen in fury. The Corvins had folded without firing a shot. That meant his fleet was now orbiting a neutral planet, and any attack would be seen as aggression, not defense. Sir, the human ships are breaking formation, his tactical officer reported. They're heading toward the planet. They're not engaging us. Maria smiled as the shadow of Earth descended toward Corvin Prime. The Kralix had made a critical mistake. They'd assumed this was about military confrontation. But humanity had learned something crucial over the past month. Most of the galaxy didn't actually want to fight for slavery. They tolerated it, profited from it, looked away from it, but when forced to actively defend it, most chose not to. The Corvins had been negotiating with human diplomats for weeks. They'd been shown the economic projections, the shifting political landscape, the writing on the wall. Given the choice between certain profits from legitimate trade with humanity or uncertain futures clinging to a dying business model, they'd chosen pragmatically. All ground teams, you are clear for extraction, Maria announced. Corvin authorities are cooperating. You have 30 minutes before local security vacates the auction complex. In the underground passages, Zira and her team burst into the holding pens. The prisoners inside looked up in shock as armed figures appeared through the darkness. Zira deactivated her stealth field, letting them see her face. We're here to take you home, she said in 3 different languages. All of you. Right now. A young Valorian child stared at her. Are you real? Zira knelt beside him, remembering a similar child from her own captivity. I'm real. And so is your freedom. Come on. The extraction took 20 minutes. 300 prisoners, some barely able to walk, were guided to landing zones where human shuttles waited. Medical personnel treated injuries on the spot while soldiers secured the perimeter. Not a single shot was fired. High Commander Zarthok watched it all happen from orbit, his mandibles grinding in frustration. We could stop this. One bombardment would kill the prisoners we claim to be protecting under labor law, his political officer interrupted. Would validate everything the humans say about us. Would lose us every remaining ally in the council. Sir, we've already lost this battle. The question is whether we lose just this battle or the entire war. Zarthok knew he was right, but accepting it felt like swallowing glass. The humans will be insufferable after this. Yes, sir. But they'll also be right. As the last shuttle lifted off from Corvin Prime, Maria allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The Kralix fleet remained in orbit, impotent and furious. The prisoners were safe, and across the galaxy, billions watched the footage, seeing the Kralix Third Fleet hovering uselessly while humans rescued the enslaved. Sometimes, she reflected, the most powerful weapon wasn't a gun. It was making your enemy look foolish for opposing you. Set course for Armstrong 7, she ordered. Let's get these people to safety. As the human fleet departed the system, nobody tried to stop them. The Kralix had come to crush the rebellion, but they'd left having demonstrated only their impotence. It was a humiliation that would echo through the galaxy, and in that humiliation, more species would find the courage to stand up. The day of the vote arrived with all the gravity of a storm about to break. Unity 7 Station hummed with activity as delegates from across the galaxy gathered for what many believed would be the most important council session in generations. Outside the massive viewport windows, ships from hundreds of worlds waited, their crews watching the proceedings through live broadcasts. Ambassador James Howard stood in the human delegation chamber, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. His hands were steady, but his mind raced with all the possibilities of what might happen in the next few hours. Behind him, his staff worked quietly, monitoring communications from Earth and the colonies. Sir, we're getting reports from the latest operations, his aide said. 3 more successful extractions in the past week. Total rescued since this began, over 2,000 individuals. James nodded, but his focus remained on the upcoming vote. Numbers were powerful, but they weren't enough. The council had to want to change, had to choose morality over convenience, and that was far from guaranteed. A chime indicated it was time. James straightened his jacket and headed toward the main chamber. The amphitheater was packed beyond capacity. Every seat was filled, and additional delegates stood along the walls. The gallery above overflowed with journalists from countless worlds. This wasn't just council business anymore. It was history. Speaker Velshara called the session to order, her voice amplified throughout the vast space. We gather today to vote on Proposal 7743H, comprehensive anti-slavery legislation with enforcement mechanisms. The human delegation will present their case, followed by opposition testimony, and then the vote. James walked to the central platform, acutely aware of thousands of eyes fixed on him. He carried no notes, no prepared speech. Everything he needed to say came from the past month's work. Members of the council, he began, his voice clear and strong. 30 days ago, I stood here and promised that humanity would not stop fighting slavery. Some of you called us naive. Others called us dangerous. Some said we were too young a species to understand the complexity of galactic politics. He paused, letting that sink in. You were right. We are young, We don't understand how civilizations can watch suffering for generations and call it complexity. We don't understand how the value of life can be negotiable. We don't understand how any being can look at captive children and see profit margins. Ambassador Gorvax surged to his feet. This emotional manipulation is not manipulation, James interrupted, his voice hardening. It's reality. And if acknowledging that reality makes you uncomfortable, perhaps that discomfort is telling you something important. He activated a holographic display. Images appeared above the chamber. Not propaganda or carefully curated footage, but raw documentation from the rescue operations. Zira's face appeared, bruised and terrified. The Valorian child asking if the rescuers were real. The holding pens, the shock prods, the casual cruelty. These are the faces of what you've called traditional practices, James said quietly. These are the beings suffering while this council debates semantics and jurisdiction. Several delegates looked away. Others leaned forward, their expressions troubled. James saw Ambassador Kress from Valoria, whose stance had been neutral, staring at the image of the Valorian child with something like horror dawning in his eyes. We have provided evidence of 147 separate slaving operations, James continued. Operations that exist because enforcement is a joke, because economic interests outweigh moral ones, because it's easier to look away than to act. He deactivated the display. This proposal changes that. It creates actual law with actual consequences. It establishes a joint enforcement fleet with representatives from any species willing to participate. It provides funding for victim rehabilitation and repatriation. And it destroys legitimate businesses, Gorvax growled. There is nothing legitimate about slavery, James replied flatly. No business built on suffering deserves to survive. The debate that followed was fierce. Dozens of delegates spoke, some supporting the proposal, others opposing it on grounds of sovereignty, economics, or tradition. The Kralix delegation made impassioned arguments about the chaos that would follow such dramatic change. Several corporate representatives warned about market disruptions. But as the hours passed, James noticed something shifting. Delegates who'd been silent were speaking up, sharing stories from their own world's histories. The Lyrian representative spoke of her people's time under occupation. The Valorian ambassador, his voice shaking, described receiving news that the child in the image was his nephew, missing for 2 years. I told myself it was politics, Ambassador Kress said, tears streaming down his face. I told myself that neutrality was wisdom, that we needed to be practical. I told myself my nephew was probably dead, so what did it matter? He looked directly at James. Then humans found him on Corvin Prime. They brought him home. And now I have to live with the knowledge that I could have helped save him months ago, but I chose politics over family. The chamber fell silent. Finally, Speaker Velshara called for the vote. All those in favor of Proposal 7743H signal now. The voting display lit up. Green lights appeared as species registered their support. James watched the count climb, his heart pounding. They needed 2/3 majority. The number crawled upward, 50%, 60%, 65%. The measure passes, Velshara announced. Comprehensive anti-slavery legislation is hereby enacted as council law, effective immediately. The chamber erupted. Some delegates cheered, others shouted in protest. The Kralix delegation stormed out, their fury palpable, but James barely noticed. They'd done it. In 1 month, humanity had changed the fundamental laws of the galaxy. His aide appeared at his elbow, face glowing with triumph. Sir, we're getting responses from across the galaxy. 23 species have pledged ships for the enforcement fleet. The Lyrians are offering their space stations as rehabilitation centers. Even some former neutral parties are— What about the Kralix? James asked. The aide's smile faded. They've withdrawn from the council. They're calling this act of war against their sovereignty. James felt a chill. War. The word he'd been trying to avoid. But as he looked around at the celebrating delegates, at the freed prisoners watching from Earth and the colonies, at the fundamental change they'd forced into existence, he knew there'd been no other way. Sometimes peace required confrontation. Sometimes justice demanded risk. On Armstrong 7 station, Zira watched the vote broadcast with dozens of other rescued beings. When the results came through, the room exploded with emotion. People cried, laughed, embraced strangers. A young Valorian child jumped up and down shouting, "We won, we won." Zira found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. They had won. Not just this vote, but something bigger. They'd proven that change was possible, that the galaxy could be better than it was. Dr. Sarah Kim appeared beside her. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Zira said slowly, "that maybe hope isn't foolish after all." Sarah squeezed her shoulder. Hope backed by action is the most powerful force in the universe. Across the galaxy in the Kralix Imperial Command, High Commander Zarthok stared at the vote results with cold fury. The Council had betrayed them. The humans had won. Everything the Kralix had built over centuries was crumbling. "Prepare the first and second fleets," he ordered. "If the Council won't protect our interests, we'll protect them ourselves." His officers exchanged nervous glances. "Sir, that would mean war," Zarthok finished. "Yes, the humans want to be heroes. Let's see how they handle a real conflict." But what Zarthok didn't understand, what none of the Kralix truly grasped, was that humanity hadn't just prepared for rescue operations. They'd prepared for exactly this response. They'd known the Kralix wouldn't go quietly. And when backed into a corner, when protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, humans had a long history of doing the impossible. The Kralix were about to receive an education in human warfare. It would be a lesson written in fire and steel, and it would teach the galaxy something important. Humans were kind until you gave them a reason not to be. The Kralix First Fleet entered human space with all the confidence of predators who'd never known fear. 70 warships, including 5 dreadnoughts, each carrying enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. High Commander Zarthok had chosen the human colony of New Hope as his target, an agricultural world with minimal defenses and a population of 2 million. He would make an example. The galaxy would watch New Hope burn, and they would remember what happened to species that defied the Kralix Empire. "All ships, maintain formation," Zarthok ordered as they approached the outer system. "Weapons armed. We hit the orbital stations first, then begin surface bombardment. I want—" His tactical officer interrupted. "Sir, sensors are detecting multiple contacts. Human ships exiting faster than light travel. How many?" 12. "No, 20. Contacts increasing." The officer's voice climbed with each word. "Sir, there are hundreds of them." The main display updated, and Zarthok felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: genuine fear. The human response wasn't measured or cautious. It was overwhelming. Over 300 ships filled the space between his fleet and New Hope, everything from military destroyers to converted cargo haulers bristling with weapons. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. Behind the main fleet, massive shapes emerged from FTL, ships larger than anything intelligence had reported humanity possessing. 5 enormous vessels, each dwarfing the Kralix dreadnoughts. "What are those?" he whispered. His science officer's voice shook. "New construction, sir. They're calling them Protector-class carriers. Our databases have no information on them. A transmission request came through." Zarthok accepted it, and the view screen showed Captain Maria Chen, her expression colder than space itself. "High Commander Zarthok," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have entered Terran Federation space with hostile intent. You have 30 seconds to reverse course, or what?" Zarthok snarled, trying to regain his composure. "You're outnumbered and outgunned." Maria smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Actually, you're outnumbered 3-1. And as for outgunned," she leaned forward, "would you like a demonstration?" Before Zarthok could respond, one of the Protector-class carriers fired. Not at his fleet, but at a small asteroid in the system's belt. The weapon was unlike anything the Kralix had seen. A focused beam of energy that didn't just destroy the asteroid but seemed to unmake it at the molecular level. Where a kilometer of rock had existed, only vapor remained. "That's what humans build when we're not trying to save lives," Maria said quietly. "That's what we build when someone threatens our worlds." Her eyes hardened. "You have 20 seconds. Zarthok looked at his tactical display, at the overwhelming force arrayed against him, at the weapon that could delete his ships from existence. He thought about his plan to make an example, to show the galaxy Kralix strength. He'd made an example all right, just not the one he'd intended. "All ships," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Reverse course. Full retreat." As the Kralix fleet withdrew, messages flooded communication channels across the galaxy. The footage of the confrontation spread instantly. analyzed and dissected by every military power and independent observer. The consensus was universal. Humanity had been holding back. For the past month, they'd used minimum force, precision strikes, non-lethal tactics. Everyone had assumed that was the limit of their capabilities. They'd been wrong. Humanity had been fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and even then they'd been winning. Now the other hand was visible, and it held weapons that made the great empires nervous. On Unity 7 Station, Ambassador James Howard fielded calls from dozens of delegates, all wanting to know the same thing. How had humanity built such ships in secret? When had they developed such weapons? What else were they hiding? James's answer was always the same. We hoped we wouldn't need them. We still hope we won't. But we learned long ago that hoping for peace while unprepared for war is just wishful thinking. The Kralix Empire, meanwhile, was fracturing. The defeat at New Hope had shattered their reputation of invincibility. Systems that had paid tribute for generations suddenly questioned whether that tribute was necessary. Slave trading operations, now illegal under council law and facing human enforcement, began shutting down voluntarily to avoid becoming targets. The Kralix leadership realized, too late, that they'd made a critical strategic error. They'd assumed humanity's morality was weakness. They'd confused compassion with cowardice. They hadn't understood that a species could be both kind and capable of overwhelming violence. That the choice to save lives didn't mean an inability to take them. On Armstrong 7 Station, Zira had received her assignment. She would serve as a cultural liaison aboard the newly formed Council Enforcement Fleet, helping rescued captives adjust and acting as a bridge between species. It was meaningful work, important work, and she was grateful for it. But as she prepared to leave for her first assignment, she found herself in the observation deck, staring at the stars and thinking about how much had changed. 3 months ago, she'd been property, a thing to be bought and sold. Now she was a person again, with choices and a future. Dr. Sarah Kim joined her at the viewport. Big day tomorrow. Yes, Zira agreed. Sarah, can I ask you something? Anything. Why did you do it? Not humanity as a whole, but you personally. You could have been a doctor anywhere, doing anything. Why risk your life for strangers? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. You know what I learned in medical school? Every person who comes through those doors is somebody's whole world. Someone's child, parent, friend, lover. When you start seeing people as statistics or resources or problems, that's when you lose your humanity. She turned to Zira. You weren't a stranger to me. You were a person who needed help. That's all the reason I needed. Zira felt tears welling up. You humans are strange. We've been told that, Sarah replied with a smile. Across the galaxy, the changes continued to ripple outward. The Council Enforcement Fleet began operations with ships from 40 different species. Trade routes previously used for slave transport were now patrolled by joint task forces. Rehabilitation centers opened on dozens of worlds, staffed by volunteers from countless civilizations. It wasn't perfect. Some systems refused to comply. Pirates and criminals still operated in the shadows. The Kralix Empire, though weakened, hadn't completely abandoned the slave trade. There would be more battles, more confrontations, more people who needed saving, but the fundamental equation had changed. Slavery was no longer tolerated, no longer ignored, no longer profitable enough to be worth the risk. Species that had looked the other way now took action. Governments that had been complicit now cooperated with enforcement. And humanity, the young species that had stumbled into galactic politics barely 2 decades ago, had become the conscience of the galaxy. Not through conquest or domination, but through the simple, radical act of caring about suffering and doing something about it. Captain Maria Chen stood on the bridge of the Shadow of Earth, reading the latest mission briefing. Another distress signal, another group that needed help. She smiled slightly, remembering when they'd started this campaign with one ship and a prayer. Now they had a fleet. Now they had allies. Now they had proof that change was possible. All stations prepare for faster-than-light travel, she ordered. Let's go save some lives. As the ship jumped to FTL, leaving a trail of bent starlight in its wake, Maria thought about the Kralix guard who'd laughed when Zira begged for mercy. She thought about all the beings who'd believed power meant you could do whatever you wanted without consequences. They'd learned differently. They'd learned that humanity's kindness was a choice, not a weakness. They'd learned that when that kindness was met with cruelty, humans didn't break. They adapted. They armed themselves. They became the thing that monsters feared in the dark. And most importantly, they'd taught the galaxy that perhaps the old way of doing things wasn't the only way. That morality wasn't naive. That standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves wasn't weakness but the highest form of strength. The message had spread across countless worlds. Translated into hundreds of languages, shared in whispers and broadcasts and official declarations. We are coming. We will not stop. Every chain will be broken. And for billions of beings living in fear, those words became something precious. They became hope. The galaxy would never be the same again, and that was exactly as it should be. Because sometimes all it takes to change the universe is for someone to care enough to try, and to refuse to stop until justice is done. The humans had arrived, and they'd brought their ideals with them. The old empires could adapt or fade away. The choice was theirs. But the age of looking away from suffering was over. Humanity had made sure of that.